ARG's session. TCS is a very proud sponsor, and this time we are talking to you about the digital identity and security conundrum. We'll be spending next 65 minutes with an esteemed panel who would be talking us through the entire digital identity situation and what the future entails. I'm very proud to invite to speak to all of us today, Professor Leandros, who is from the School of Engineering and Applied Sciences of Yale University. He is also with the Yale Institute of Network Sciences. We have Richard Gendel Brown, who is the CTO of R3, the organization which is behind Corda, the platform which is used by many, many organizations. And then we have Daniel Butchner, who is responsible for the entire DIF solution that we've all heard of that Microsoft is currently running, and he's responsible for decentralized identity there. And we have my colleague Hanumanta Rao, who goes by Hanu. He heads partnership and technology of the blockchain services of TCS. My name is Preeti. I will be walking everybody through the next 65 minutes. I head marketing and communications for blockchain services of TCS as well. Without further ado, Richard, if I may request you to start us off on digital identity and what the future holds.
Thank you. And first, thank you for having me and inviting me to this panel. As you say, I'm Richard Brown, Chief Technology Officer at R3, the firm behind the Corda blockchain platform. Given I was asked to present first, I thought I'd take the opportunity to perhaps provide a piece of, I guess, broader context to hopefully position the idea of self-sovereign identity or decentralized identity in the broader concept of identity. And the reason I thought of doing this, and the reason I think it may be important, is that quite often in my days at R3 over the last 5 years, people have brought me problems that looked on the surface to be novel or hitherto unsolvable problems in identity. And it turned out actually there already were solutions. So I've learned from those conversations it's important to try and decompose these concepts. And my second objective is, knowing the eminence of the panel, I wanted to bring a few questions of my own, because there's a few things I don't quite understand either, so I don't pretend to have all the answers. But let's go back to basics. For me, the fundamental problem we have, whether it's in the analog or digital realm, is that sometimes you're presented with somebody, let's talk in terms of humans, you're presented with somebody who you don't know, but you need to know something about them. Maybe it's their name, maybe it's their age, maybe it's whether they're allowed to be in the country or whatever it is. But there's somebody you don't know, and there's something you want to know about them. Now, interestingly, sometimes it's possible to answer the question without anybody else's help. I can look at somebody, I can't guess their age, but I can tell you if they're over 40 or less than 25. And that's usually enough to be able to successfully run a bar, if any bars were actually open during lockdown. But more often than not, if I don't know that person, I need the help of somebody else. And this is, I guess, the fundamental problem of identity in both the analog and the digital realms, which is, if there's something I need to know about you, but I don't know who you are, I need to find somebody that I trust who knows you, so I can ask them the question. And you can do that in lots of different ways. A driving license is issued by somebody I trust, the driving authority, and they tell me something about you that I don't know, which is your name and your eligibility to drive. And there's lots of examples of this. The canonical one would be a certificate from a university that attests to the fact that I have a degree from that institution. We call it a certificate. And we have that same problem in the digital realm. Now, of course, in the digital realm, when a person presents themselves to me, I don't even know if they are a person. The thing I'm being asked to reason about, the thing that I need to understand, is invariably a public key. There's a public key I've not seen before, or I don't know anything about, and yet I need to understand something about the person or persons or organization or organizations that control it. Is it a human or is it a firm? If it is a human, what is their age? Are they entitled to do something? And just as in the physical realm, I need help from somebody I trust, I can do the same thing in the digital realm. And applying that analogy from the physical realm, we call these things certificates. What is a digital certificate? It is a digital document. It is a document that makes a very, very simple claim. It says, I, somebody you trust, perhaps a certificate authority or somebody you know, I assert that somebody else who perhaps you don't know who has this key has the following attributes, and I sign it. There's a direct analogy from one to the other. And that fundamental problem of identity in the digital realm, having somebody you do trust or know being able to make an assertion about somebody else, it's a fundamentally solved problem. You use your browser, you go to something that purports to be facebook.com, you don't know what facebook.com's SSL certificate should be, you don't know what their key is, but you trust Microsoft, whose browser you're using, or you trust Google, whose browser you're using, and they've been pre-populated with a list of people who do know who the people on the internet are, and that's how it all gets married up. So you trust that you're correctly at Facebook because you trust your browser manufacturer to have pre-installed certificates for the right issuers. So there's this kind of trust thing going on, which is, I want to know something about you, but I need some third party to attest to it. The interesting thing, and I think this is where we get into the decentralized world and the self-sovereign world, and it's where I'm really keen to hear from the others on how they're solving these problems, is what if we could democratize that? Facebook has a certificate. Facebook can prove to me who they are, but I can't prove to them. I don't get to have a certificate. I don't get to prove to Facebook who I am. I don't have a certificate that proves to a website that I'm over 18 and therefore I'm allowed to buy alcohol from them. I don't have the ability to go to an online store and prove that I am in a certain country. They've got a certificate, but I haven't. So there's this interesting answer. There's a question that says, well, what if we could democratize access to these things? Why can't everybody have a collection of these certificates in the digital realm, just as they do in the analog realm, to prove different things about them? And on the other side, if these things existed, think of all the things different service providers could do if they could ask these questions about people who would otherwise be strangers to them. But, and this is where I'm really interested to see where this conversation goes, I think there are two really hard questions we have to answer. One is, how do we solve the bootstrapping problem? I made a throwaway comment a few minutes ago about how the way I know I'm on Facebook is because I trust Google, Apple, or Microsoft to have installed the right certificate into my browser. I didn't have to go to the trouble of populating them or choosing them. How would I know? I just click yes, yes, yes. I just want to get to the website. So in this realm where anybody could be presenting different kinds of assertions to me, how do I know who I can and can't trust? How do I bootstrap it? How do I do that? And I'd love to understand how we get that going, because I think it's a fundamental problem to be solved. And then the second question I have is, given how many good things I think could come from this ability to be able to prove things about myself to other people, to be able to understand things about other people for myself, it just seems so obvious to me that this is inevitably and almost easily something that the major tech firms could offer. You could just imagine next year's announcement of iOS 15 and the Apple Wallet has been extended to allow you to have digital versions of all your paper certificates as a starting point to somewhere else. So there needs to be a really compelling reason for why a decentralized, distributed, and self-sovereign approach is going to be the dominant one against the convenience that would inevitably be there if it were to be offered by one of the mega firms. So they're really my questions that I'm hoping to explore. How do we bootstrap this, and how do we make sure there's enough value, utility, and convenience in a decentralized approach to overcome the immense attraction of a centralized, curated approach that the big tech firms could, if they wanted to, roll out. So thanks for having me. I'm looking forward to the conversation.
Richard, you raised a lot more intrigue in this for me, so I'm glad you added to a few more questions to the battalion that I had for all of you for the latter half of this session as well. Some very interesting points mentioned by you over there. Professor Leandros from Yale obviously is taking a very academic perspective to it. Professor, can I request you to spare a moment telling to us how do things feel from a research angle, and then again we'll head back to the practicality of it with Daniel and Hanu. Professor, over to you. Professor, you're on mute.
Hi everybody, thank you Preeti. Hi all again. So we got into blockchain, the blockchain world in general. Coming from networking, actually my group works on wireless ad hoc network primarily, and we considered blockchain developments as a possible enabler for creating a framework for off-grid networks. So, and that is the title of my presentation. I would like to briefly share the experiences we have tried to approach all the issues arising in blockchain by considering the scenario of enabling off-grid networks. Let's go to the next slide, yeah. Enabling off-grid networks using all the virtues provided by blockchain. Very briefly, off-grid networks they are considered as a possibility for providing impromptu connectivity in environments where there is no infrastructure, and it is embraced lately both by the Internet Society and the IETF as a solution for that purpose. Blockchain, on the other hand, provides important attributes like transparency, security, and distributed governance, which is very important enablers for off-grid networks. So we embarked on this effort of developing what we call the DEON and decentralized off-grid networks, a decentralized off-grid network that leverages blockchain in a way that will enable the citizens and communities which are the users of such a network to access applications and services which are not part of the traditional internet infrastructure, and provide internet connectivity to the grid into the local network communities. Let's move to the next slide. The key issues we try to address in DEON is first data ownership, that is which node essentially controls which data depending on which node is the offerer, let's say, of the data, and would like this to be fully distributed. Would like to enable decentralized governance in the sense that we have network-wide consensus and synchronization without the central authority. Then I would like to support identity mechanism in a way that doesn't depend on a central node for managing credentials, and enhance security for users and applications. Next slide. So we embarked into an approach to do this using blockchain on one hand and distributed file storage that is provided by IPFS. So we wanted to eliminate data silos, that is a frequent problem in this context, and would like to eliminate supernodes in the management of data. We wanted decentralized identities which are rooted on blockchain essentially, and would like to enable sovereignty of the identity process to the users. And we wanted this framework to be scalable, both as far as the data management is concerned, as well as the identity management. And scalability and trust are two issues which are in some sense conflicting, and different approaches covers each one better. Next slide. So in order to address that, we considered a combination of a private permissioned ledger to deal with the data management, and a public permission ledger for providing the identity. And more specifically, we use the Hyperledger Fabric in combination with IPFS for managing the data, and Hyperledger Indy and Aries for the identity management. So in order to do that, we had to extend Fabric from its form like 2 years ago, and enhance it with capabilities like signing of transactions, verification of transactions, as well as verification of client identities. Next slide. So this is still evolving. The architecture is not complete yet. I mean, we're almost there. But when it is, this is the envisioned functionalities. So essentially, we'll provide a marketplace of data and services which are shared and modified in a symmetric fashion by the different entities that are part of the off-grid network, irrespectively of the means they use to do that. Next slide. So the DEON vision overall touches upon important issues that would like to address. First, security issues, and essentially it uses decentralized technologies like the one that I presented to improve the security of off-grid networks, which is an important issue actually. Off-grid networks have been developed having in mind connectivity first and security second, so that is an important enhancement. And the assurance provided by blockchain will help in many ways, and it's present in DEON, including data logistics, issuing and management of identities, as well as routing of identities between the different agents. And finally, the digital identity, it's an important aspect of DEON in all layers of functionality, starting from the distributed identities at the user level to the identities of piece of data and association of data with users, as well as association of access and modification rights. So I think I'll stop here. I hope I gave you a flavor of how we experienced the different virtues provided by blockchain and how we view their integration to address important problems in off-grid networks.
Absolutely, Professor. I think it was very interesting to hear from you about the off-grid aspects of it that bring together a lot of portions of the community that probably could go unserved. I would definitely come back to you and ask you a few more questions on this thought process as well. In the meanwhile, Daniel, you've been on the ground working on this through your foundation, doing some great work in this area with the refugee community and others. Please share your thoughts on digital identity of the future and what it means.
Yeah, so I'll try and present maybe one view of identity that's a little bit expansive, potentially more than identities maybe been seen in the past. I think it's specific to the blockchain space. You hear about how blockchains are going to solve all sorts of things, and I think it's specifically that technology that's kind of brought out of the woodwork all these use cases that are purported to need all sorts of exotic, solutions. And I would sort of posit to you that most things in the world that aren't money, if they're digital, are really identity problems. And honestly, you could probably solve almost all of them with decentralized identity. And why I say that is because identity is essentially the underlying encoding of everything you do and say and interact with in your life. We may not consider it that way, but it really truly is, in the sense that even this program that we're talking on right now is a meeting of identifiers that are provably backed by material that can prove that each one of us on the call owns these identifiers, and I'm streaming data potentially signed and secured by identifiers. So even what we're doing right now is an exchange of identity data. To illustrate our view of identity at Microsoft and elsewhere, and pick maybe one example out from the blockchain space, one that's been used by a lot of companies, is supply chain. It's really easy to understand identity in the context of humans. Like, everyone thinks of that. They think of the bar use cases, or I'm presenting a credential, or it's me. Not many people think of identity in some of these other use cases where you might just think it's like a business solution problem. So supply chain is a good example in the sense that people might come up to you and tell you need some exotic networks and some, different types of solutions that are, just bespoke. And I would assert to you that most of these problems are just identity problems. For instance, in supply chain, you have a chain of suppliers from the producer to the person who ships it overseas to the distributors, and all the hands in between are essentially adding some sort of signatory assertion. Really, that's what it comes down to. And it doesn't need to be more complicated than that in many ways. So instead of some sort of blockchain network or some overburdened solution, you can equip, if we had decentralized identity, you could equip every machine and person within that flow with the backing credentials that prove they're maybe an employee of a company that's owned by the shipper or the manufacturer. And when they sign throughout the course of a supply chain, the proof that they've handled a good or service and then hand it off to the next person. That accrued proof, which is really just an identity credential that has multiple layers, suffices in many cases, in most cases, in fact. And the reason I bring that up is because really identity is the underpinning, right? It is the platform and the substrate by which I think a new world of apps will be created, whether it's the unification of private text messaging apps like Telegram and Signal. I mean, is there really any reason why we would have decentralized identifiers that are backed by public and private keys, which link to personal data stores that can transmit data and signal, and still continue to have these apps that are defining their own separate protocols for authentication and encryption of messages and sending? I don't think we need that. I think decentralized identity brings us a unified messaging layer. Same thing with apps. I use Google Keep for shopping lists right now, and I like the app. I mean, the UI is great, but wouldn't it be? I mean, is there any reason why the data has to reside with Google? I mean, it's a list, right? It's a list of things. I think it'd be a whole lot better experience if I could have an app that's loaded just in HTML, CSS, and JavaScript on my phone, and I would give it permission to my personal data store, and it learns of one of my IDs, and it stores data in relation to that ID, but with me. So it's the same exact interface you might see in Google Keep. It's just that there's no man in the middle. And I think that that's probably a better, infrastructure and paradigm for most application developers. Most application developers really enjoy the idea of serverless, but to date, we really haven't given it to them. We've given them servers somewhere on a provider you choose that you must pick and manage through code. I think it'd be a lot better if I could just say, write basically a client front end, and it's going to store the data wherever the person's identity stores their personal data. So it really, if you see identity as an expansive substrate, not just a prover of facts between humans, but really the core of every entity's ID on the planet and the interconnectivity through personal data stores, you can kind of remake the web and remake it in a way that really gets rid of a lot of these useless middlemen who do nothing and add no value. So that's my personal view of identity. Some of those views are shared by my employer. Obviously, the first thing we're working on is credentials, which is traditional identity, what you would expect, because that's a core competency of ours. But as time goes on, the infrastructure is there. We hope to expand into other areas as well.
Daniel, I think that was brilliantly put. I especially thoroughly enjoyed your thoughts on how it's always been there, and it has to come to the people now. Which brings me to Hanu's presentation, where he's talking about how identity helps in empowering people as well, and how it needs to kind of infuse across the board through the network. So Hanu, over to you.
Thanks, Preeti. First, let me talk about what are the various identity systems, types of identity systems, that we have. In fact, each one of us in the call, are part of our internal identity systems, right? TCS has its own identity system by which, I'm identified. Same is the case with Professor and Richard and, Daniel, who is identified within the Microsoft internal identity systems. So traditionally, these have existed ever since the, computerization has come into picture. So these are the traditional centralized identity systems. And then that is at the one end of the spectrum. So we have an identity system. There are various attributes about us in these identity systems, and this identity information is traditionally owned by this centralized, whomsoever is running those centralized systems. At the other end of the spectrum are the emerging models of self-sovereign, decentralized identity systems. So there is an identity that is created of us. We are enriching it with various credentials and the others, and then that information is owned only by me and not anybody else, and I choose to keep it. The organizations like diff are defining the standards as to they say that the standards say, hey, this all this information about me I choose to keep where I want to keep, and only I own it, not the information holder. That is at the other end of the spectrum, which is the self-sovereign decentralized identity systems. And then in between, Chris, you can go to the next slide. In between, we have what are called, the federated identity systems. These federated systems are, we have it in some way at this point of time. We go and create an ID with Apple or with Google, and then with Amazon, and then we say that when we go and try to log into a different website, we can say that, hey, use the information from Google. So typically through OAuth and the others, that information is used. So there is an identity provider, and then there is a relying party. So that is the federated systems, which is in somewhere in between the centralized systems and the self-sovereign decentralized identity system. But however, there is still a problem with that model right now. The ownership of the data, as Daniel talked about, whatever you do on Google, typically Google owns it, or whatever you do elsewhere, they own the data. So you can theoretically you can have an identity system somewhere between the federated and decentralized, where you go and keep the data somewhere, but they may have the data, but only you are the owner of the data, not the others. So that's these are the various models that we have. Truly, we believe that that where we are going towards is the future of self-sovereign identity model. So we can go to the next slide. So how do these self-sovereign identity systems work? As Daniel has mentioned, it's all about credentials, and Richard also talked about it. It's all about credentials. You create an identity for yourself, and then you enrich that identity by making a various series of claims, and then have those claims attested to by others. Then they become the claims. They're not just the claims anymore, they are the attested by others. And then when for example, my bank knows a lot about me, about my financial history, they can attest. I can claim that I have so much in my bank account. That claim has a value if the bank attests to that. Now when I go to a different bank and then try to take a loan, they want to know how much of bank balance that I have for whatever reason. I can present them to the claim that I have an account elsewhere and I have so much money in it, and it is attested by the bank. Then this other bank, which is trying to give me a mortgage, can rely, if they trust the bank that has attested my claim, then they can rely on the claim and then give me a mortgage. This is broadly how the claims and attestation systems work in the decentralized identity world. You make a series of claims. So those claims can be about educational credentials, your financial credentials, your health credentials. Then you present those claims to the others. They can rely on them if they trust the attesting parties. So if you can go to the next slide, when you have a decentralized identity system with a series of claims that are attested, then you can present those attestations. There are a series of scenarios in which such systems can be used. You, for example, take the current scenario of COVID. Now, somebody has a COVID and then they have recovered. They probably have some level of immunity. Set aside the, the fact that we don't know how long they are immune. Or look at the post-COVID scenario where the vaccines and others come when you take a vaccine, and then you probably will have some level of immunity. That immunity, the fact that you've gotten a vaccine, can be attested to by the Quell Diagnostics or whomsoever have given the vaccine, or your primary care physician. You have it as a verified credential. Now, if I want to go to my office, for example, maybe 6 months from now or 10 months from now, my building manager may say, hey, I'll let you into the office only if you can prove that you are immune to COVID, you're no longer infectious. I can show them my the immunity credential, which is a part of my immunity wallet, only I have access to. I can present to that, which they can verify that it is attested by my a doctor or a hospital, and they can let me enter into the building. So this is this is basically we believe that this is the future in which we are going to go towards a self-sovereign digital identity system. Of course, there is a series of steps that need to be taken from the time where we are now to the centralized world towards this decentralized world. There will be a series of steps in between. It'll be interesting to see how we progress. With that, I'll hand it over back to you, Preeti.
Thank you, Hanu, and I think you brought us to a very interesting segue. My main question to all of you is that decentralized identity in some form or the other, and all of you alluded to it, has always been there, right? So how do we make it more mainstream, and how do we make it more usable from a customer experience perspective, leave alone the internet protocols and the certificates, etc. But how do we make it more mainstream? How do we make it more tangibly experiential, if you would? And this question is open to all four of you. Perhaps Richard, you could go first.
Thank you. So I'm probably, this is going to sound bad, I'm probably the worst person to answer this question, because that's actually my question as well. Because if I take that last example, Hanu, about the proof of having had COVID or being negative, if I think about that scenario, let's imagine what I need to have in place. So let's imagine a generic wallet. Let's imagine it's not even a medical wallet. I've got, and I always find that if I'm struggling to understand the digital realm, I think, well, there's always an analog. So what would the physical equivalent be? So let's imagine I had this there's these bundle of papers that I carry around with me: my driving license, my passport, my maybe my my university credentials, and now I've got this certificate that says I am immune from, or I've been vaccinated against COVID-19. The two immediate questions I have are, okay, great. When I go to, I need to enter a building and they want to check that that I've had this vaccination. There are two questions the person facing me on the other side of the gate needs to answer. Is this a genuine certificate? Has it been issued by somebody who was entitled to issue it? And that, of course, is in the eye of the beholder. This is a decentralized world. Maybe they trust one medical network, but I've got mine from a different one. So how do we align things so that the certificate or certificates I've got are highly likely to be acceptable to the other side? So there's that question of it's a coordination problem, if you like. And then there's perhaps a more technical problem, but it's one that we have to resolve. And of course, it's the revocation problem, because that certificate was valid on the day it was issued. But how do we know it hasn't been revoked, either because I've subsequently become infected or because the vaccine batch was discovered to be defective, or perhaps. So it's not sufficient to have it. You have to know that you're looking at the most current version. Now, of course, in the physical realm, that's very hard. In the digital realm, in old money, you talk about things like certificate revocation lists and CDPs, and OCSP and that kind of stuff. But you need an answer for that in this new world as well. So I think I subscribe to that vision. If I had some app on my phone that I was able to use to convince people of all the things I needed to convince them of, it would be awesome. But that question of the coincidence of acceptance, who is the relying party, which attesters are they likely to trust, and have I got my certificates from the right ones, and then how they know whether it's been revoked or not. I think whoever answers those questions most satisfactorily is in quotes going to win here, is my bet.
And that is the holy grail of it, isn't it? So, Daniel, you probably done this a lot and come across this a lot from a real life standpoint. Have you found the holy grail?
Yeah, I don't know that I'd call it that exactly, but you know, Diff has a couple standards that I think are going to help with this. One thing, obviously, with credentials, you know, from the start of the flow, is the ability to even get them. So we're reasonably confident, I think, at Microsoft and most of the Diff membership, you know, that works on various DID methods, that the core identifier layer is becoming a solved problem. Like, there's a lot of systems that will work for this. You know, we're working and contributing open source development to one of them. But after that, you know, it's about, once you know someone's ID and maybe it's an issuer, how do you know what they can issue? And, you know, it starts even before the acceptance at the office you go to. And so knowing what someone can issue is the first step to getting issued that. So we have a spec that we call presentation exchange at Diff. It's almost there. It's almost over the hump and being ratified by the working group, but certainly stable now. And it allows you as an issuer to assert through this thing that we call a credential manifest, basically a set of requirements that you need to provide. And those requirements say, like, you know, I need you to prove this from this set of IDs, or anyone that's from this network, basically giving you that set of things that you need to do to get to attain this license or whatever it might be. And then when you can submit those things, and then they'll evaluate them, and they'll, you know, give you a response back, which is hopefully the credential that you're looking for. Once you secure that credential, the same exact spec is used for asserting, this presentation exchange is used for asserting that you need to present a credential, maybe not to get anything in return this time, but present it for proof purposes. And so these are things that wallets will be able to look up. They'll be able to index these credential manifests, these objects that say, here's what I can give you, and these presentation exchange objects that say, you know, here's what you need to prove, and be able to collect these together and understand, maybe even before going to the office, the doctor's office, wherever you need to go, what you can need to bring and who you might need to get it from, and what's acceptable and what's not. So those two specifications together, I think, get us a long way down the track. Now, it's not perfect. There's still some discoverability things we're working through, and I think discoverability is a big one. Some of the ledgers or solutions, it's not a ledger like Ion, have this kind of global directory capability. One of the other specs that we're bringing to bear, hopefully soon, I mean, I think it's 12 months out, but is the secure data storage, you know, personal data store work. Once we have that, now we can do broad discoverability, because we can look up an ID, get links to a personal data store that has a semantic set of data, which includes these objects I talked about, and kind of crawl and look for, like, who's offering what credentials, who requires what, and do it at scale and do it quickly. Way more efficiently than even like Google crawls the web, because we're talking about like deterministic and semantic data. So once we have all three of those pieces together, and this is still a little ways out, I think then we get to these really seamless experiences, but it's not here yet.
Sure. Professor, based on your experience and the work that you've done on off-grid networks, how easy do you think it would be to interplay what Daniel was just speaking about in such opportunities? And how easy or complicated do you think it would be to interoperate it as well with the existing on-grid systems?
Yeah, coming, let's say, from the user side and more like from the consumption side of this technology, since we don't work specifically on developing new identity, like new mechanisms for distributed identities, but more like taking advantage of what is there and integrate it with the current needs. What we can certainly say is that we see an explosion of needs of DIDs in several different contexts, and specifically with off-grid networks, and even taking a step further, considering Internet of Things scenarios where we have a high degree of heterogeneity in addition to many devices. We somehow see that the current centralized schemes certainly do not scale, and that will be the main driver. And what Daniel mentioned is certainly a possible way of evolving in that direction. And I would say, based on the need primarily and the recent advances, we expect that within the next 2 decades, DID from marginal technology should be the prevailing one. Otherwise, the evolution of the technology with the required connectivity will be held back, let's say.
Sure, I understand. Hanu, all this brings me to the question of assurance, right? Walk me through how do you get all this built, all the hundreds of APIs that come together on a digital identity protocol that I set for myself, or that any enterprise is setting up, and how do you make sure that those systems run smoothly? Talk to me a little bit.
Yeah, in fact, let me bring, two perspectives to this. One, I'll try to synthesize the various points that, the other panelists have talked about and build out an example of how a, DI-based, credential-based system can be built out, can be bootstrapped to address one of the things that, Richard talked about. And then I'll talk about the assurance of all of this. For example, here in TCS, let's say, we have our own centralized identity system. Let's say I build a decentralized identity system. Let me call it a skills marketplace. We have more than 400,000 people in the company. They're working on thousands of engagements, and people have specialized in different areas and different skills. They're taking, they're doing projects, they're building work experience, they're doing certifications, they're doing training courses, they're attending, universities, online courses, all of that. So people are building up their profile. They have their credentials. Assume that I create a decentralized system where I enter all my skills, and each one of those skills, I enter claims about those skills, and each one of those skills are attested by whomsoever has verified, whether it is by university or by Coursera or Microsoft for Microsoft certifications, the project leader, and then TCS does certain assessments, and TCS does the certification. So various various notarized attestations are done. Now I have this system, this internally. Now I make it self-sovereign decentralized system. So all this data about me, I own it. I have all these claims. Those are all certified by the others. I own this data. Now I go to, let's say, Daniel. Hey, Daniel, I want to work with you on diff related activities. Daniel wants to know whether I have experience in this. Now, so I have various claims based on my experience on the decentralized systems. By the exchange Daniel talked about, standardization of the data exchange. Using that mechanism, my application sends those attestations to Microsoft and to Daniel. Now Daniel looks at these attestations, looks at who. Now he needs to have a mechanism. When I say his application systems need a mechanism to find out who have actually certified that I have all this experience. So there is an amount of discoverability. So he looks at the signatures and then some kind of a directory for which the standardization work is going on. They look at, for example, TCS has certified these skills. Microsoft has certified these skills. R3 has certified these skills. Yale has certified these skills. So the discoverability aspect will bring in, okay, this is by Yale. Let me verify the signature, right? That's how the trust is built into that. Then Daniel knows I have worked on all of this because he trusts Yale's, the assertion, and he can verify that. That is how you. So I created a system which I'm originally using it for TCS, and then I made it decentralized, still for TCS employees. Then I have brought in the R3 and the others, an ecosystem with the data exchange standards of diff, and then and the directory and discoverability and all that. Then you can expand the network and others can use it. That's one way how you bring in the, you start somewhere and bootstrap it, so that you can make it available to the community, thanks to the standardization efforts of different the others. That is one perspective. Now, once you have built out a system which is integrated with many others like it, then how do you bring in the assurance aspects into it, right? If you look at the assurance is something that we have been doing for a long time. What is assurance? You have a system, and then you want to make sure that it is working according to the spec. There is a specification aspects, functional specifications and non-functional specifications. Is it working correctly, right? That is one aspect that you want to do. And the second thing that you want to do is the whole system working, in a very intuitive, in a user-friendly manner. So we are bringing the aspect of, user experience to it. So you have a functional correctness that you want to verify. You have non-functional aspects you want to verify. One aspect of non-functional, there are many aspects to non-functional. You have, the performance, and you have the security. And one of the most important things in the user-centric design world of today is the user experience aspects. That is on one dimension that you want to verify, which we have been doing for a long time, right? Ever since the computerization again. And then the second aspect is that, again, the traditional techniques, testing techniques or assurance technique, the white box testing, the black box testing, again, which we have been doing for 30, 40 years. Bring all of this together is how you assure any apps, irrespective of whether, whether it is on the traditional legacy systems or in a blockchain-based systems. Blockchain-based systems, for example, is nothing different. They are, at the end of the day, they're multi-tiered architected systems. There is some user interface, there is some middleware, there is some backend layer, and blockchain sits in the backend layer. Of course, it's a complicated distributed system which has got its own nuances. But if you assure, if you know that the underlying platform is working correctly, whether it is R3 Coda or the others, I'm not talking about the platform assurance aspects. If you make an assumption platform is working correctly, which is how we do when we talk about application assurance, we would assume that underlying databases are working correctly, underlying blockchain platforms are working correctly. Then you focus on the front end and the middle layer and the back end layer, the functional, non-functional aspects, white box, black box testing, make sure that everything is correctly. This is how you do the assurance.
Got it. So I have two questions. One, as an individual user, how do you assure me, and this question, anybody is free to answer that. How do you assure me that my data is private? I still have complete autonomy over it. And my second question is, how do I make all this look cool to people like me who don't care for the entire nuance of how it works in the backend? Who would like to answer me?
I can.
So
go ahead, Richard.
A quick comment on the second one: how to make it cool. As Hanu was talking, I was thinking about user experience, and I don't know, but I kind of wonder whether we'll know we've succeeded when we don't even notice this is happening. I was just reflecting as you were talking and as Daniel was talking, and I was thinking, before we started recording this, I received an email and it said I needed to connect to a site called StreamYard. That's who we're connecting it on. I don't know what their public key is. I don't know I was connecting to the right site, and yet somehow here I am. So as everyone was talking, I looked, and I'm connected here on Google Chrome. So I looked at, how do I know I'm really talking to StreamYard? It turns out that their identity and their public key is attested to by a certificate authority called Let's Encrypt. But I don't know what Let's Encrypt's key is. So how do I know that certificate's genuine? Well, it turns out that in turn, theirs is issued by someone called the Digital Signature Trust, who I'd never even heard of. So how am I supposed to know that I can trust them? But it turns out that somebody in Mountain View, somebody working for Google, has checked them out, thinks they're good, and they've automatically whitelisted them in Chrome. So because all of this chains back up to something that Google thinks is okay, this just works. It's seamless. I can connect. It just works. But it's because at the heart of this, if Google is paying people to go and check that various certificate authorities, various issuers of credentials, of various signers of claims are good at the job and can be trusted. And they've pre-populated this list. And if you're on that list, you can issue them and you've got a business doing that. If you're not on the list, you don't. And it's seamless. And if this StreamYard site that we're recording this on hadn't had a certificate from one of these issuers, I wouldn't have been able to connect. I would have got all kinds of horrible, scary messages. So I guess I guess we'll know we've succeeded on the identity side when we've got these wallets with our credentials as individuals, and we share them with somebody, and it's completely seamless. But somehow we've got to the point where these things are pre-populated, either because we've learned, and this is the bit I don't understand. I don't know how this bootstrapping happens. How does my wallet know who the trusted issuers are for different things? I can see, to Daniel's point, how issuers can these issuers of claims can say, here's the information I need to see in order to be able to issue one of these things. I can see how they're found and exchanged, but how do I know who I trust? And I think once we've nailed that, there won't be a cool user experience. It will be an invisible, seamless user experience, and then we'll know we've succeeded. At least that's how I think it will play out.
Yeah.
I think the way that we kind of see this taking place is that it's going to sound like a CA list when I say it at first, but it really isn't. In the sense that CA lists are these lists in the sky that really a few companies just arbitrarily tell you, and you don't have any control over. There's no variability. It's just a list, and you use it. What we think the future might look like is Microsoft will, we have vendor relationships and partner relationships with a bunch of companies, thousands, and we have direct knowledge of their domain names, their IDs, all sorts of stuff. So we already can assemble a massive list across the Fortune 10,000 and say, you know what, we're sure. I don't know about you, but we're sure that this ID is, for instance, Ernst & Young or something like that, some company that we work with on other things. And we keep a list of that. And we think that in our personal data store as a company, Microsoft, we will have a trust list that we expose that you can read and you can make sense of however you want. We'll say these are the IDs we believe are these companies. You can go to their data stores and pull their credentials and examine them all you want. They might have credentials from some other really well-known IDs, like the secretaries of state in certain states that regulate the business licenses. And if you have a core of IDs that you absolutely trust, right? Like you're like, I trust Microsoft, it'd probably be some crazy thing if like one of their, they made the wrong connection. And then a few of those other companies, you can start walking this sort of circle of personal data stores from yourself out, right? Here's my like first round connections that I have high trust in. And then they say, because I get their trust lists and I pull them in, that these are who they trust. And then I can kind of, cross-link them and say, well, I and them believe this, and then my second degrees believe these third degrees. So it's a little bit of a gradation, but it can be done seamlessly and quickly by a wallet, where if we have personal data stores, if we have addressable IDs, you can do those crawls at speed, verify all the credentials attached to them, and then it becomes about UI. It's more like, if it's in your first ring of trust, you say, don't show me anything, right? Just go. It's like the green lock icon. It's like, I believe it's the right thing. If it's in the second, it might kind of, have a slight note. You start getting out there on the periphery and your wallet's it's making an effort to do validations and be intelligent. It kind of gets to a point where it's like, you must decide. And I don't think that this happens all the time, but it's new relationships. You might be on vacation and you're just outside the bounds of what you would have otherwise. That's kind of how I see the world shaping up. We're trying to build the technology to make that seamless, so it isn't revolving around one company's list. It's more like your list and how you see the world. Kind of. I don't know if that makes sense, but.
No, it does to me, and I think I've talked too much, but I do believe Microsoft's well placed for this, given this position you have in there's the enterprise side, there's the major browser user. You've already got experience of saying who do I trust. So no, I get it. It's and that's a circle. The circles is a really nice.
Yeah, I agree. Hanu, I know you had a point to make.
In fact, one of the questions that you asked, Preeti, is, how do you make sure that my data is secure, right? So we are talking about, this decentralized identity. You own your data. How do you make sure that you only own the data and nobody else? It's not anywhere else. right? I mean, there are various ways in which it can be done. For example, suppose you hold the data about you, so all the claims and the attestations only in your personal wallet and nowhere else. If it is guaranteed to you that it is not stored anywhere else, then only you have the data. Or, for example, even if there are infrastructure providers that provide you the storage providers, where you hold the data, suppose you store it in an encrypted form, only you have the decryption key. Then you know that only you have the data and nobody else, right? And then the other thing comes in. Suppose you share your credential with somebody else in a decrypted form, for example. How do you make sure? How are you guaranteed that they don't hold it, and they're storing it? But you need some kind of a solution for that. Suppose all these web of applications are built in such a way that each credential that is stored has some kind of a timer. They're valid only for that. And all the applications that are verifying that if somebody is providing that credential, is it still valid? If it is not, go back to that source, which is your wallet. If this is how these applications are built, we can ensure that you only have the data and nobody else. And to my knowledge, the ongoing work of Diff and the others provide for mechanisms like this, so that there is trust that is built into this system. Daniel, correct me if I'm wrong. Some of the ongoing work addresses some of these issues, to my knowledge, right?
Yeah. Diff is active on a broad range, I think, of these standards that are required to make all this work seamlessly. And it's really an open effort where it's super welcoming to all sizes of orgs. I would really honestly take a moment to encourage people to join this organization. It doesn't cost anything for companies up to 1,000 individuals. It's really friendly to new and upstarting companies. And we do a lot of technical work there. A lot of good work also happens in W3C, in the credentials community group and elsewhere. So those are the communities, I think, if people want to get this right, if they want to make sure the solutions are as elegant as possible, if you're not participating in these two impact, you could. Yeah.
So we have a few minutes, and I want to ask a very pertinent question, which is about purpose, right? As a technology, there's very cool things that we can do with it. For each of you, what is that one purpose that we can help achieve if we solve the digital identity conundrum? And over here, I'm talking about the sustainability goals, set out by the UN, or any such high-level purpose that the world is trying to kind of solve. What is that final purpose that you personally would like, digital identity to help solve the world? Professor, we can perhaps start with you.
Well, I think there are issues of cost associated that will determine the pace with which this will evolve. For instance, blockchains are expensive to maintain and to develop, of course. So if they will be the main infrastructure for realizing this, that's an important issue. And also the blockchain adoption is another important factor. There is some cultural resistance also that need to be overcome. And another issue is that this affects different layers of the technology ecosystem, from the lower layers of the infrastructure, that is the underlying networking and the physical layer technology, all the way up to the services, and the requirements differ as we go up the layers. So I guess all these factors will influence the evolution one way or another, and the degree of the need that comes from the demand side will be a factor of how fast all this will be overcome.
Thank you for that, Richard.
So I guess I come at it from this may sound a bit weird, but almost from an elegance context. If you think about the discovery of the Higgs boson, in the particle physics community, the way the story goes, the reason they even wanted to look for it was because in their model, in the standard model, there was a gap. The diagram was not elegant. It was not symmetric. There was a gap, and it just seemed wrong that was how nature was. It was just clear there must be something to fill that picture. And if I look at the difference between the digital world and the analog world, in the analog world, yes, there have been some cultures in the past with a very, very top-down authoritarian approach where there was one identity card that you must use for everything, and if you didn't have an identity from the state, you were a non-person. But most societies are far more decentralized than that. The sovereignties with the individual. I have a driving license, I have membership cards, I have lots of different ways of proving different things about me. I can be different people in different contexts for different purposes. That seems to be the direction of travel. That's the sort of thing that feels like an ideal. We don't have that in the digital realm. We have I don't have something similar, and it kind of feels like there's a gap. And if it were to be filled, it would be just a net plus for humanity. I think there are a lot of problems to be solved, and we're working on one of them. This idea of when you share data, how can you control how it's used? That's solved by confidential computing, things like the Conclave platform where we're building. So it's more than just identity standards, but you bring it all together. I think there's a net plus for humanity. So I think there's a real prize to be won here if we keep our eyes on that prize.
Absolutely, Daniel.
Yeah, I mean, I think that more and more in the world, your digital self is just as important as your physical self, because a lot of the things that impact you from a distance. And I think it started with like the Pony Express was the way to send letters, so it was very physical. So you couldn't impact people with your thoughts very quickly, and then that all changed when you just had the basic internet. And it's the same thing with trust and digital identity. This is kind of entering into a space where we're going to open up a ton of capabilities, and we could do it with centralized systems. But if you did it with centralized systems, I think you would inevitably, somewhere in the world, you're going to end up with a dystopia built in the systems. So when we talk about like sustainability goals and things of that nature, I'm a libertarian personally, and I believe that this is maybe the biggest fight that we're going to have as technologists, is ensuring that this technology is there to keep people's communications proof and how they progress through the world, their travel, everything in a freer state than if we had just left it to be some cluster of companies or governments to define a singular top-down means of doing all this.
Very, very well put. I totally appreciate that. Hanu, your thoughts to help us close.
Yeah, in fact, as Daniel mentioned in his initial talk, everything that we do is about something to do with identity. And so far, so identity is central to pretty much everything that we do. If there is a very trusted way of identifying somebody or something, we have not even talked about, we've mostly focused on identity for people, then there are identity of things. If there is a trusted way of identifying people and things, and trusted way of the verifying, or there is a trust built into their credentials, then there is any number of things that we can do, any number of problems that we can solve, whether it is the refugee crisis, banking for the underbanked, environmental crisis, and the sustainability goals. And if you have sensors that we have, let's say, string up sensors in villages in India, and we get the information from the sensors, and look at our cities, for example, Delhi, with the pollution, and we look at the information from those sensors, and then look at the trend of that, that pollution, and then we identify the sensors. We know it is coming from the correct sensors. It is not, it is in a immutable fashion, so we can trust the data. And then so we can look at how the pollution levels are going up or going down, and take the corrective actions. There are so many things that we can do if we can identify people and things and trust the data. So
Really exciting portrayal of a potential future. Also, we spoke a lot about the conundrum that is currently there. Richard, I hope this esteemed panel helped answer a couple of your questions, but I know we have a lot more. But we hope to continue this dialogue. We hope all of you, awesome people, continue to achieve great things in the space of digital identity. To the audience of BRI, thank you so much for watching this session. If you have any questions for any of our esteemed speakers, you could write to us and we'll pass along your questions to them to help answer. And thank you for watching.